DC cooks up a rather cool-looking Catwoman. Here's your relook at the DC Comics designer series Darwyn Cooke, figure number 7, Catwoman. Eisner Award-winning writer-artist Darwyn Cooke is back with a second series of designer action figures, including some of the DC Universe's greatest heroes, The Flash, Green Lantern's John Stewart, Wonder Woman, and Catwoman. Each figure measures approximately 6.75 inches tall. It seems as though we're going to be following along this feline a second trip, as we certainly have had a look at this figure before. Viewer Kelly, a longtime viewer, had asked if I would consider going back and re-reviewing the Darwyn Cooke Catwoman, one of her personal favorites. More than happy to oblige, Kelly. And certainly, before we have a look at the figure, we're going to first break down, not literally, of course, how tall the figure actually stands. 6.9 inches in height is the actual height of Catwoman. And that, in centimeters, works out to be 17.5 centimeters tall. For the accessories, Catwoman comes included as what you would expect her to come included with, a whip. What I wasn't expecting necessarily the first time that I had a look at this Catwoman was the fact that the whip is made of a real cord. I was thinking, if anything, getting this out of the packaging, I was going to be disappointed yet again by the idea of just a spiraled up, you've seen these times before, just a whip spiraled up and sculpted in plastic that you couldn't do really much of anything with. No, instead you're treated to a full whip, quite considerably long in fact. And I don't want to really find fault with something the fact that they would include real threading, but I do feel it's a very long looking whip. It probably could have easily been maybe, I don't know, 3/4 the length of it. This could easily be rectified by me just taking a pair of snips, pair of scissors, and cutting that off. Whatever excess I feel is unnecessary. To be fair also, the fact that they also gave you as long of a whip as they did, you could, in theory, wrap it around Catwoman's waist. Possibly it's something to consider doing before you pull out the scissors. Anyways. Looking at the handle of the whip, it's all molded black plastic. There's not a whole lot going on for it. It follows the same trend as Catwoman, which really uses sculpt to its favor. Doesn't use much in the way of paint, as you'll see when we have a look at the figure. But the whip has just little notches added to the handle, just enough to give it a little something extra, as opposed to just being simply a smooth handle. You can fit it into her hand, but you can only fit it into one hand, as the other hand gives you a permanent sculpt. I'll talk about that in a second. But if you want to put the whip into her hand, I just usually navigate it through the loop, and then I just continue to feed it on its merry little way until eventually I get the whip in hand. As I said, though, it's a long whip, so you might find yourself sort of just wrapping it around, maybe not to the point where it looks like it's choking Catwoman, but you may want to kind of do a little bit more with it. You can kind of even drape it around her fingers, I suppose, as the fingers are articulated, or at least the hand is articulated. You can drape the excess kind of over her hand. It's a lot of whip, but at least to be fair, and speaking of the positives, at least it's not molded plastic, so that's something. We're going to go ahead and take that whip out of her hand. Don't really need to address it anymore, I feel, right now. And let's have a look at Catwoman. Now, I can certainly understand why Kelly would have wanted to look at this figure again. It's got some real interesting aspects to it, something of which that isn't seemed to be shared by other Catwoman figures out there. Darwyn Cooke definitely has a very unique style to him. Translates well to a figure, if not for the fact it does have very little in the way of additional paint. Catwoman, known by this costume anyways, is generally all black anyways, but this Catwoman really is devoid of every other color except for black and a little bit of silver that runs up the middle here in a zipper, which actually has a really fun feature to it. It actually has like a real loop that they've actually sculpted in place. I don't even know why they would have felt the need to put that in there. I mean, to me, pulling back at least the cost involved. I mean, even if they had just sculpted it like that, you know, just a piece of plastic. It didn't have to be a fully functional, because unless you're doing this with the figure, you're probably not even going to know it's there. I just want to point it out draw your attention to it. The buckle also is done in silver. And she also does have a couple of buckles on the sides of her boots, all done in silver. But other than that, I mean, she's really relegated to only being all black. Looking at the head sculpt, though, it's a really, again, unique style of Catwoman, very faithful to Darwyn Cooke's designs. I did notice that when I mentioned when I talked about the figure the first go around, I did talk about how I felt unattractive. This figure felt unattractive looking at her in the packaging because her face seems so flat, round and flat. But it's really until you sort of tip it on its side or like look at the side profile of the figure that you notice that there's a lot of really cool, fine, yes, but cool looking features on this figure, despite for the fact, again, when you look at her straight on, it looks like her face has been smushed. She's got some nice coloring also to her as well, some eyeshadow right above the eyes, bold black outlining around the eye area, right down to the fact that they've actually sculpted in, or painted in rather. It looks like the indication of eyelashes. I really like the look of that. The eyes are pretty. I think I would have maybe pulled back a little bit the panel lining that they did around the lips. It does look a bit messy, though nothing is really missing its mark. It's not like it's carrying its way onto her face. I think it's just the fact this really, really dark line around the red lips that from a distance does look a little on the messier side. If they maybe had made that a lighter color, but I know that sort of defeats the purpose of Darwyn Cooke's designs in the first place. Really, again, I like this design character, not so much necessarily straight on, but if you get her from a certain angle, I mean, she really has some cool personality aspects to her as well. This is the short-eared cowled Catwoman. That's a mouthful to say, which does have the goggles along the top. They are not removable, nor can they be dropped down onto her face. I like the reflection that they've added, some additional light source of this little, kind of looks like little shark fins on both sides, done in a warm orange, with these little dots on either side opposing that in a yellow. I really think that those goggles are some of the coolest that I've seen on a Catwoman figure. She has some real interesting colors even to her face. I know we talked already about her eyelashes, her eyelids done in a warmer color, and also not even mentioned it, but her eyebrows are also a very bold black line. But even like the skin tone that they used for her as well, it's a little bit, not quite a pale complexion. There's definitely a little bit more warmth and a slightly darker tone to her skin coloring. I like that. I think it's done really well. For the rest of the figure, now this is sort of where the rest of the details don't get necessarily lost, but because of Darwyn Cooke's designs, what you're really getting is a lot of these little wrinkled areas, almost excessive it seems at times. Things like her thighs, for example, you could never really chalk up to the fact that a Catwoman should have really this many wrinkles going in her thighs. But again, that's like the design that he's known for, and this figure definitely has a lot of that going on. Wrinkles and these little crease marks running down the sides of her leg, all the way down to her boots. It's all the way up her back as well. And it's also in her arms as well. Now, I've been a big fan of collecting Darwyn Cooke's designs. They don't always, I feel, translate well to figures. Even though I have collected them, some of my favorites I feel were like the Jon Stewart, for example. Batman wasn't too bad, but characters like Wonder Woman I felt looked a little on the uglier side when you eventually translated them from the source material of a two-dimensional image and you translated that to a three-dimensional sculpt like these. They don't always lend well to the character or to the comic artist designs. They look good on paper, but they don't always work well as a plastic figure. Catwoman, I feel, is a good exception to that rule. I think she looks good. If maybe when you're looking at the figure in the packaging, you immediately dismiss her as being that ugly Catwoman figure. It's really, again, until you get her out of the packaging, you start manipulating her head, kind of getting her in different cool poses, like with her head, for example, that you really see there's a lot of cool other stuff going on to this figure. Things that you don't see until you eventually get to see her in a more different perspective. And that's really the crucial key when it comes to collecting figures. Sometimes the figures don't look good in packaging. They don't sell well in packaging. And that's all the more reasoning why I really advocate the idea of getting these guys out of the packaging, or these females out of the packaging. You can really experience and find some more joy out of them that you may not have found initially when you pick up the figures the first time in their sealed plastic prisons. For their articulation on this particular Catwoman, it's pretty limited, I have to admit. She does have her head articulation, which I've sort of been playing around with this whole entire review. The head moves quite freely all the way around, up and down, left and right. She does have waist articulation, which is good as well. It does, obviously, as you probably could guess it, break the silver panel lining that started well here, and then immediately just veers off the side of the road as soon as you turn her waist. But it's unavoidable. You can't overlook, can't really help that so much. The arms do hinge out. not almost at a 90-degree angle, but just a little less than that. A lot of it is because of the shoulders, the way that they're sculpted. You just can't bring the arms any further out than what you're doing currently right now. But they do still rotate all the way around. She has a bend at the elbow. No arm articulation necessarily. It's only just kept to a hinge. That's it. And then she also has hand articulation. This one hand is sort of not a problem necessarily for the figure, but I feel at times like I don't know what I want to do with it. I mean, if it had simply just rotation happening here, I could at least rotate it inward and have it resting against the side of her thigh. As it stands right now, it's sort of, I guess you can kind of do somewhat of a sultry pose with it, but it just looks like it doesn't really know what it necessarily wants to do. I guess you could kind of just have it straight out like that and have her hand just sort of off to the side. Might be what I end up doing with it, because I've actually not had this figure on display for a very long time. Now that I'm kind of getting the experience of really enjoying this figure again, I find myself actually very interested to the idea of taking Darwyn Cooke's Catwoman and finally putting her back on display where she hadn't been for the longest of times. Anyways, for her legs move forward to about there. You can't go any further than that. And you can also move them back slightly. The big problem also with this figure I'll mention in a second. Just remind me if you can. Yeah, like you can remind me for that. Hinge at the knee. That's as far as you're going to go. And she does have foot articulation. What I was going to say, though, on this particular Catwoman is she has some real difficulties standing. Unless you're making use of a display stand, her feet never really quite feel like they're firmly flat-footed. And a lot of times when I'm putting her on display, for example, sure, standing her in a straight museum pose is fine and good. But you want to get a little bit more interesting with that. And even when you do have her standing like this, sometimes she does want to topple over. So what I usually do is I just make use of a display stand. This happens to be one from NECA. It's not to say that you have to keep specifically that stand for the figure. But if you want to kind of get her in a little bit more of a pose, you can most definitely make use of the stand. The only problem with it, though, is because you really can't compensate with her ankle. Let me just show you what's happening here. Because you can't really compensate here, you're always going to have a figure that looks like she's sort of looking to make sure she doesn't step in a neighboring puddle. I mean, right there. So unfortunately, you can't quite get her fully flat on her feet. Not really sure why that is the case necessarily. But I guess if you want to have her in a slightly more walking pose where one leg is maybe moving forward, you could probably pull that off as well. And then it won't really matter necessarily that she isn't touching the floor anyways. Because again, looks a little ridiculous, sure. But at least you can get her in somewhat of a pose other than just having her standing straight and neutral. Admittingly, not everyone's going to dig Darwyn Cooke's designs translated from two-dimensional comic pages to a three-dimensional figure like here in Catwoman. I will admit, and be the first person to admit as well, of all the DC comic designer series, Darwyn Cooke is one of my least favorites. There are good positive ones out there. Some of them I've actually liked, like The Flash. But for every good Flash and Catwoman, there's been a bad Wonder Woman. And like I said, Darwyn Cooke, I don't think does well in comic pages, but doesn't always lend well to the idea of releasing as a figure. Catwoman was sort of following the same trend when I was having a look at all these figures in the first place. I was picking her up and thinking, I'm not really liking the look of Catwoman. Her face looks too wide, it looks too flat. It doesn't look like she has really any distinct features like a nose that sticks out, for example. But when you get her out of the packaging, and then you put her in a pose, or you have her doing something other than just standing straight in a museum pose, especially when you get their head slightly tilted, do you see some of the features that get lost, I feel, when you have her in her plastic prison. When you're looking at her straight on, it's not so much an appealing figure, but when you look at her slightly from the side, or again, if you have the head slightly turned, you really do appreciate the care that they would have put into this figure, recreating as best they could the original source material that Darwyn Cooke initially drew on those comic pages. One thing that Darwyn was known for doing, though, was incorporating a lot of light, using white lines to accentuate some of the wrinkles in the costume. This just can't translate well to a figure because all those wrinkles end up just being molded plastic, and the figure looks excessively over-wrinkled in the costume. I've considered the idea of even taking a very fine paintbrush with a little bit of white paint and going in and filling in all those lines, so it actually looked a little closer to the source material. But then I realized, if that was the case, and you have so many of these lines all over her body and her costume, if I was to put those in white, I think it would be too much and would even end up ruining the figure. So I'm just going to leave it as is, except the fact that this is as close as we're going to get to Darwyn Cooke's designs. To be fair, I think Catwoman is the better figure that's come out of the designer series for Darwyn Cooke. She didn't look the case necessarily when she was in the packaging. But again, when you get her out of the packaging and you put her in something other than just standing straight, you'd be surprised how much you end up liking this figure after all. If you manage to pick up this one for yourself, let me know down below in the comments section what you guys think of the Darwyn Cooke Designer Series Catwoman. She's really not that bad of a Catwoman after all. Again, once you get her out of the packaging. Thank you again to Kelly, who had asked if I could re-review this figure, and through sort of that, I found my newfound love for this figure that sort of got forgotten for a while because I'd put her away in storage. Now that I'm looking at her again, I'm feeling compelled again to put her on display where I feel like she rightfully belongs. If you guys are new to this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below, turn the bell notification on, and stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of videos coming your way. And if there's anything that you'd like to see me re-review of, say, things that I've reviewed in the past, let me know down below in the comments section. As always, guys, thanks for watching as you always do, and I'll see you guys next time.